Hi, I'm Carl Weber. Welcome to Video-Aided Instructions series on how to write a great research paper. If you've been watching the whole series in order, you've come a long way. We've talked about how to develop a topic for your paper from a broad subject area. We've looked at techniques for finding and selecting the best sources of information and ideas for your paper. We've shared some techniques for doing effective research and note-taking. We've discussed how to develop a thesis that's interesting and compelling, how to support it with evidence, and how to outline and organize your paper. And we've talked about how to incorporate findings from your research into the paper, whether through paraphrasing or quoting, and how to make the whole paper read smoothly and naturally as your own work. Now we're ready to tackle one of the challenges most students find most nerve-wracking: providing the scholarly apparatus of footnotes and bibliography that teachers demand when grading a research paper. If you've never written a research paper before, you may be quite nervous about this aspect of the process. The rules seem so complicated and arbitrary, a little like the etiquette rules for which fork to use for each course at a fancy banquet. How can you remember all those rules, and what will happen to you if, heaven forbid, you get one of them wrong? I'm here to say, don't worry. The rules aren't really as complicated as they seem at first. In this program, we'll explain how they work and, I hope, make their underlying logic clear. We'll also tell you about where to find simple explanations and reminders about how to apply the rules so that you never need to worry about making a mistake. After all, writing a research paper is a lot easier than attending a fancy banquet in one respect. You get to check and revise your work before anyone else sees it. Wouldn't it be nice if we could do the same with our etiquette mistakes? The first thing to realize is that there's not one set of rules for scholarly citations. There are several, each of which differs from the others in small but significant ways. Which one will you use? Which set of style rules will you follow? Well, that's up to your teacher. It depends in large part on the subject area you're studying, since different fields generally use different scholarly styles. The different styles are set out in what are called style guides. These are publications that lay out the procedures, formats, and rules for scholars and students to follow. Here are the best-known style guides. It's virtually certain that one of these will be the right one to use for your paper. First, the American Psychological Association, or APA, style guide is used in the social sciences, not just psychology, but also sociology, economics, sometimes in history. The APA style guide is available in book form in most large bookstores and also in most libraries. A basic introduction to APA style that discusses some of the most important rules is available online at http://www.apastyle.org. Now, APA style is a variation on the style that is generally used in the natural sciences. There's no single style guide that's generally regarded as authoritative in all of the natural sciences. However, there are individual style guides for most of the major fields: biology, chemistry, physics, astronomy, environmental science, geology, and so on. For example, in 1994, the Council of Biology Editors, now known as the Council of Science Editors, published a style guide that was later picked up by journals in many natural science fields. The science style guides are generally similar to APA style. If you're working in one of the natural sciences, ask your teacher which style guide he or she recommends. Now, the style guide of the Modern Language Association, or MLA, is used in the humanities: English, foreign languages, philosophy, art, music, and usually in history. There's a published book version of the MLA style guide, and a few of the basic rules are also available online at http://www.mla.org/style. Another style guide that's very widely used is this book, The Chicago Manual of Style, published in regularly updated editions by the University of Chicago Press. For this reason, this form of scholarly citation is often called Chicago style. Many publishers, including publishers of scholarly books and journals, use Chicago style, and as a result, it's widely accepted by teachers in many fields. Again, there's an online version of the Chicago Manual, but in this case, it's only available through paid subscription. The web address is http://www.chicagomanualofstyle.org/home.html. Finally, a favorite style guide among many teachers and students is a little book by Kate L. Turabian called A Manual for Writers of Term Papers, Theses, and Dissertations. Usually this book is referred to simply as Turabian. And Turabian is basically a compact, easy-to-use version of the Chicago rules. So Turabian's procedures are very similar to those dictated by Chicago. Which of these style guides should you use? Ask your teacher about which style guide is preferred for the particular course and/or paper that you're working on. Most teachers will have a definite preference. If not, if your teacher says, well, you can use any generally known style guide, you might want to choose the Chicago style, and especially in the user-friendly form of Turabian. All of these style guides are available in most libraries, and many of the style rules that you'll be using for your research paper are also available online. Nonetheless, it's a good idea for most students to own one of these guides in hard copy form, that is, to buy the book, preferably the one that's favored in your major field of study. If you're an English major or a French major, then get the MLA guide. If you're in the sciences, then get the APA or some other relevant style guide. If you own the book, you'll find yourself mastering the basic style rules more quickly than if you have to look them up at the library or online. And it's certainly handy to have access to the style guide when you have a last-minute question about some format issue at 2 in the morning when the library is closed and you're trying to get your paper into final form. In theory, the way your paper looks shouldn't be very important. After all, isn't it the depth and clarity of your thinking and the care with which you've conducted your research that really matters? Yes, but looks matter too. Even a teacher who doesn't consciously take the appearance of your paper into account can't help being influenced by it. A paper that looks attractive, well-organized, clear, and professional conveys an impression of competence and intelligence, and this can sometimes be enough to boost a grade of C+ to a B or an A- to an A. Naturally, you should check with your teacher about any special requirements or preferences that he or she may have about how your paper is typed and printed. Otherwise, the following guidelines won't steer you wrong. First, fonts. Nowadays, computers give you a wide array of type styles, also known as fonts, that you can use when preparing your paper. But avoid being tempted by the colorful, creative, offbeat styles that are available. These are fine for a poster or a personal letter or your club newsletter. But for a research paper, stick to a simple, classic typeface, preferably one with serifs. Those are the little doohickeys at the ends of the letters that add a slightly formal feeling to the typeface. A typeface with serifs as opposed to one without is considered more appropriate for a research paper. Times New Roman is the default font for many word processing programs, and it's a good choice. Georgia is another serif face that's quite attractive, and some people prefer it to Times New Roman. Your study guide contains a list of more suggestions regarding research paper typefaces. We recommend using 12-point type for your body text and your bibliography, and 10-point type for your footnotes. You can use a larger font for the title of your paper. 16 points is a good choice. Computers also allow you to play around with type in various other ways. I recommend using the italic, slanted type style for any words that in old-fashioned typing would have been underlined. That includes words that you want to emphasize or stress, although this is a stylistic technique to be used sparingly. Don't italicize a lot of words for emphasis or stress, otherwise it starts to lose its effect. You would also italicize the titles of works that are published separately, including full-length books, plays, long poems, journals, magazines, and other periodicals. So whenever you refer to one of these sources, you would italicize its title. Italics are also used for foreign language words that are quoted in your paper. Don't use boldface type, color printing, or other unusual variations in type style. And don't print words or sentences all in capital letters for emphasis. A research paper should look like a serious scholarly work, which means a rather formal, simple style. And of course, you will print your paper on one side of the page only, again, unless your teacher, for some reason, specifies otherwise. Next, spacing. Your text should always be double-spaced. Don't play around with spacing in an effort to get around your teacher's length requirements. For example, don't try using triple spacing to make a short paper look longer, or space and a half to squeeze more words into fewer pages. Those tricks are usually obvious, and teachers don't appreciate having you trying to fool them. The exceptions to double spacing are your footnotes and bibliography, both of which will be single-spaced, and any block quotations of 5 lines or longer. That, too, would be single-spaced. Margins. Set your computer to produce margins of at least 1 inch on all 4 sides of each page. Now, in published books, I'm sure you've noticed that lines of text are usually justified. That is, they're made to fit exactly the same width on the page. They do this by using small variations in the spacing between words to make the lines come out to exactly the same length. Now, computers can imitate this style, but when writing a research paper, don't justify your text. Instead, use what are called ragged right-hand margins, lines of variable length. There are 2 main reasons why ragged right-hand margins are preferable to justified text. One is that justified lines often look awkward with the computer inserting weirdly wide spaces between words sometimes in order to fill out the line. The other reason is that your computer may use hyphenation to break words in order to justify the line, which can result in awkward breaks that may cause momentary confusion for the reader. Your paper isn't a published book, so don't justify the lines. Instead, use ragged right-hand margins. Indentation. Indent the first line of a paragraph by 5 spaces, or about ½ an inch. This is usually set by an automatic indent control in your word processing program, and set it for that size spacing if you have a choice. Be sure to keep this consistent. Block quotations should be indented 1 inch, or about 10 spaces, and use, of course, an additional indentation within the block quotation as needed to show new paragraphs within the long block quotation. Title page. Again, your teacher may give you specific guidelines as to whether to use a title page or not, and if so, what to include on it. If not, here are our suggestions. You don't have to have a title page, and if your paper is short, 10 pages or less, you shouldn't have one. Instead, just put your name, the date, and the name of the class for which the paper was written at the top of the first page. Then type the title on a line by itself, centered, skip a line, and start your paper. If you've written a long paper, you can use a title page if you like. It would include the same information that we just described, spaced out attractively across the page, something like the title page in a published book. Don't put artwork on your title page, and don't use fancy type fonts, color, or other design elements to try to imitate the design of a book cover. Again, the key concept is keep it simple and serious looking, and that way your reader, your teacher, will respect your work as a serious scholarly effort. What about header and pagination? Well, what do these mean? Well, first of all, it's a good idea to have a header on each page. That is a line of type that goes across the page and is the same on every page. It should include your name and perhaps the title of your paper, or a shortened version if the entire title won't fit. And that same line, that same header line, can also include the folio or the page number at the right-hand end of the header. Most word processing programs allow you to set up a header and insert it automatically on every page of the paper, except, that is, for the first page. You shouldn't have the header there. Start counting the pages of your paper with 1 for the title page or the first page. However, you wouldn't put the page number, also called the folio, on that title page. Instead, start including the folio on the first page of text, which would normally be page 2. Using a header like this is a good idea because it makes it easy for your teacher to put the paper back in order if it gets dropped on the floor. Or if your paper gets accidentally mixed up with pages from someone else's paper, it'll be easy for the teacher to identify which pages belong to your paper, and again, put them back in the right sequence. So use a header, and that way all the pages of your paper will be clearly identified. Finally, don't bind your paper in any way. Don't put it into a loose-leaf notebook or a spiral binding or a plastic or cardboard folder or any other kind of binding. Don't even staple the pages together. Just attach them with a paper clip. This gives your teacher complete flexibility in how he or she reads the paper. Some people like to fold the pages over as they read. Others like to stack the pages separately or shuffle through the pages and compare passages on page 4 with passages on page 7. And it's impossible to do that kind of thing if the paper is all stapled together. And it's annoying to have to pry the staple loose and often leads to cuts. So let's keep it simple. Just use a paper clip only. Your teacher will probably appreciate that. Again, all of these rules about formatting should be checked with your teacher, and if he or she has different preferences, by all means follow those. But if your teacher doesn't give you any rules to follow, the rules we've just suggested should work for everyone. This is the aspect of research paper style that most students get nervous about. The main reason is simply that it's unfamiliar. In fact, the rules are pretty straightforward. The style guides give many examples of how to handle citations. They illustrate almost every imaginable type of source used in every conceivable way. So if you have the appropriate style guide for the kind of paper you're writing, you can probably find a model for the kind of citation you're trying to write. And then you simply have to follow the recipe precisely. The different style guides offer different looks for citations. MLA style, APA style, and the styles used for the natural sciences are quite similar to one another, while Chicago and Turabian style is quite different. The field you specialize in and the recommendations of your teachers or professors will determine which style you'll use most often and which style you'll find yourself becoming most familiar and comfortable with. The major difference between styles has to do with citing your references, that is, footnoting. When you refer to a work in Chicago or Turabian style, you insert a footnote giving all the basic information about the cited work. The footnote is indicated by a number which is elevated slightly above the normal line of type. This number normally appears at the end of the sentence in which the reference appears, after the final punctuation mark, which is usually a period. The footnotes are numbered consecutively throughout the paper, starting with 1 and going to 10 or 12 or whatever. And the footnote containing the reference data typically appears on the same page as the sentence. Then at the end of the paper, there's a separate list headed Bibliography, Sources, or References, which recaps all of the sources used, listing them in alphabetical order and providing all the bibliographic data in a slightly different format than in the footnote. We'll learn more about formatting this list of research sources in Part 5 of this program. Now, by contrast, in APA and MLA styles, footnotes are not typically used. Just as in a Chicago or Turabian paper, you provide a list of references at the end of the paper. However, whenever a specific work from this list is cited within the text of an APA or MLA paper, rather than using a footnote, there's a parenthetical reference within the text that includes the identifying information for the source, usually the author and the date for APA, which is so-called author-date format, and in MLA papers, the author and the page number. So let's suppose in a psychology paper, you want to refer to a book called The Quest for Consciousness, a neurobiological approach, written by Christoph Koch and published by Roberts and Company in Denver, Colorado in 2004. Okay, all of that publishing information would appear in the references list at the end of the paper. And if you want to cite some information within the text itself, here's how you would cite the information in the APA author-date format. You would do it like this. Your sentence might read, as Brodmann's map of the cerebral cortex suggests, open parentheses, Koch 2004, close parentheses, and so on. The reader would then turn to the back of the paper to find the title of the Koch book as well as the other publishing information. So you see that the basic reference is contained in parentheses inside the text. It makes it very quick and easy for the reader rather than having to refer to a footnote at the bottom of the page. And simply turning to the reference list at the back of the paper provides all the detailed information if the reader wants to track down the Koch book for himself or herself. Now, if an exact quotation is being referenced, in APA style, you would also include the page number in your reference, preceded by the abbreviation P period for page. For example, here's how this might look in an APA style paper. The, quote, balkanizing brain tissue, close quote, illustrated in Brodmann's map of the cerebral cortex, parentheses, Koch, 2004, page 119, close parentheses, and so on, and the sentence would continue from there. Now we see that an exact quotation from the Koch book is being referenced, namely the phrase balkanizing brain tissue. And that's why our parenthetical reference in APA style includes not only the author's name and the date, but also the page number. Now, suppose that in a different paper, one that uses MLA format, you wanted to refer to the exact same material. Here's how it might look. As Brodmann's map of the cerebral cortex suggests, parentheses, Koch 117 to 119, close parentheses. Or, if an exact quotation were being used, the, quote, balkanizing brain tissue, close quote, illustrated in Brodmann's map of the cerebral cortex, parentheses, Koch 119, close parentheses. Notice that in the MLA style, the date of the reference work is not mentioned, and the abbreviation P for page is not included. Small differences, but they make a difference to your teacher. So when using the MLA style, follow the MLA recipe precisely, just as when following the APA style, you follow that recipe precisely. Once again, in both MLA and APA, the reader will turn to the back of the paper to find all the relevant bibliographic information for the Koch book. Now, typically, with parenthetical citations in APA, MLA, and other styles, you include in the citation only information that's not contained within the sentence. For example, let's say that in your sentence, you have already mentioned the author's name. You don't have to repeat the author's name in your parenthetical reference. You might instead end up just including the date or page number within the APA reference, or within an MLA reference, just the page number. And if the author of the work is unknown, you would typically include an abbreviated title in the parenthetical reference instead of an author's name. The idea is simple. It's to provide enough information in the citation so your reader can identify the source from your list of references appearing at the back of the paper. And there's no need to duplicate information you're already providing in your prose. The idea is to keep it as simple and clean as possible. Now, you may be wondering, why do the various fields of study handle research references differently? And why are there all these different style guides which you may need to use at some point in your academic career? Well, the main reason is custom and tradition. You could say that the APA and MLA styles are simpler and more logical, since they do away with the nuisance of creating footnotes. Certainly, parenthetical references have their advantages. They eliminate redundancy because scholars don't have to duplicate all of the minute details found in their list of references within the footnotes. And they also improve readability. Readers don't have to shuffle back and forth between the body of the paper and the footnotes. On the other hand, they have some disadvantages as well. Parenthetical references do force the reader to turn to the end of the paper to find out the name of the work that is being cited, rather than simply glancing to the bottom of the page. So you could come up with your own preference as to which type of style you think is most logical and which you prefer. Unfortunately, as a student, you can't pick and choose. You must follow whatever format your teacher or professor requires. Now, the various books and websites that cover APA style and MLA style offer extensive examples and guidelines for the many different varieties of parenthetical references. The official style manuals are the authoritative resources for this information. You need to look them up and follow the recipes that they provide. So, for example, let's say you're writing an MLA paper and you need to create a parenthetical reference to an article with 3 authors that is located in the online version of a scholarly journal. This is a very unusual and specific type of reference to an unusual type of work. What you would do in that case is simply locate a similar example in the MLA style guide and precisely follow the format given therein. You'll find that these style guides are tremendously detailed and have very good indexes at the back. So once you've got a hold of the appropriate book, you can probably find virtually any type of reference that you're likely to make in one of your papers and find a precise recipe to follow. In a program like this, we couldn't possibly go into all the many variations that you might need to know, and in fact, these style guides do change from time to time. So the best advice is to locate in your local library or bookstore the style guide that your teacher has asked you to use, and simply have that at your side as you're working through the references in your paper. Now, since footnotes are the traditional method for citing sources, and since they're also very popular and recommended by both Chicago and Turabian, many teachers and schools do still use footnotes. So now, let's turn our attention to them. As we've already seen, you enter a footnote by inserting its number half a space above the line, generally at the end of the sentence where the reference appears, right after the period or other final punctuation mark. Most word processing systems will insert the footnote number for you in the right location automatically. Just click on a control or a command that says insert footnote, and it will magically appear for you. The word processing program will also number your footnotes in sequence automatically for you from 1 right on through the end of the paper. Do use footnotes, which appear on the same page as the text reference, rather than endnotes, which appear at the end of your paper. They are generally considered preferable. Again, if your teacher tells you otherwise and says that he or she prefers endnotes, then of course switch to that system. But in most cases, footnotes are considered better. If a footnote is too long to fit in the available space at the bottom of the page, it'll be continued on the next page. Notes should be single-spaced with a space between notes if 2 or more appear on the same page. And again, your word processing program should format the notes correctly automatically. Don't tinker with the specifications unless for some reason your teacher wants your notes to be formatted differently or they fail to match what I've just described. Now, the order of information provided in the footnote is important and it must be followed precisely. Here we are getting into salad fork territory. Just follow the etiquette rules and you'll be fine. Here's how footnoting works for a book. First, the name of the author or authors, first name, first. If there are 2 or more authors, you would list them in the same order they're listed on the title page of the book. If there are a lot of authors, 4 or more, just list the first one, followed by the Latin abbreviation et al. Et al stands for et alia, and it means and others. So if you have a book written by 4, 5, 6 people, just list the first person and then say et al. Next, title and subtitle. These should be italicized and separated by a colon, even though no punctuation is used to separate title and subtitle on the title pages of most books. Capitalize the first word of the title and every important word that appears in the title and subtitle. You would normally not capitalize the articles a, and the, nor would you capitalize a preposition unless it is stressed or emphasized. So normally you don't capitalize prepositions like by, for, from, with, to, and so on. Next, the name of the editor, compiler, or translator of the book, if any. Again, this would appear first name first in normal sequence, and you would include a word or abbreviation to explain the role played by the person. For example, Ed Joseph Jones, meaning edited by Joseph Jones, or trans and with an introduction by Mary Smith, meaning that Mary Smith was the translator of this particular work. Next, the number or name of the edition, if not first. For example, the second edition, revised edition, or deathbed edition. This is not italicized, quoted, or marked in any other way. Next, name of the series in which the book appears, if any, with volume or number. For example, if a book is part of a series, you might include a listing such as Benson University Series in Environmental Studies, Volume 5. Again, this is not italicized or placed in quotation marks. Next, the place of publication. This is normally a city name. It can generally be found on the title page of the book. Otherwise, it might appear on the copyright page, which is the reverse of the title page. If more than one city is listed, just use the first city listed. In most cases, the city name can stand alone. New York, London, San Francisco, Tokyo, whatever. But if the city is a small city or not very well known, or if there happen to be 2 or more cities by the same name, then include the state, province, or country as well. So you would list Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, since that's not a very well-known city, or Springfield, Illinois, since there happen to be towns called Springfield in a few states. Next, the name of the publisher. Again, this normally appears on the title page. Now, in some books, an imprint will be given as well as the name of the overall publishing company. The imprint is like a brand name. For example, this book, The Tipping Point, when we look at the title page, we see that the publisher is listed as Back Bay Books, Little Brown and Company. Back Bay Books is the brand name or the imprint within the larger company, Little Brown and Company. So if we were to refer to this book in a paper, in the footnote we would list both the imprint and the broader company name. We would give the main publishing house first, Little Brown, followed by a comma, and then give the name of the imprint, Back Bay Books. Next, date of publication. You usually find this on the copyright page. If more than one date is given, it usually refers to multiple printings or editions, and you would use the first date unless the copyright page somehow specifies that the contents of the book you're using were first published at one of the later dates. For example, a book that is an anthology or a collection of articles originally published in periodicals may list all of the original periodical publication dates followed by the date of book publication. You would use the latter date, the date of book publication, in your footnote. Then page numbers. Your footnote should finally indicate the page or pages to which you're referring in that particular citation. It's not necessary to include the word page or the abbreviation P. Just show the page numbers that you're referring to. Notice how you separate all these items of information with punctuation marks. For example, the 3 items that make up the publishing data, the place, the publisher name, and the date of publication, should be enclosed together within parentheses, and the place of publication is followed by a colon. Now, these rules are arbitrary, but they must be followed precisely. Why? No special reason. It's like using the salad fork for the salad and the fish fork for the fish. Here's an example of what a typical footnote reference to a book would look like. 12, that's the footnote number, linking it back to the reference in the text. We have the author name, Francis Fukuyama, followed by a comma, then the title and subtitle in italics, The Great Disruption, colon, Human Nature and the Reconstitution of Social Order. Then we have parentheses, which enclose the publication data. New York, that's the place of publication, colon, the company name, the publisher name, the Free Press, comma, date of publication 1999, close the parentheses, another comma, and then the page reference, page 119. Don't need to include the word page or the abbreviation P, just the number by itself. Everyone who's familiar with footnote form will know that means page 119. And we have a period at the end of the whole thing. So this is what a typical book footnote would look like. If this particular book had an editor or a translator, if it were published as part of a series, those kinds of information would also be included as indicated in our outline before. But this is a fairly simple footnote, and it just contains the basic information as shown here. Now, for an article in a journal, the organization of information in the footnote will be slightly different. Here's how this would be handled. First, the name of the author or authors of the article, following the same rules that I gave for a book footnote. In other words, list the authors in the same order in which they're listed in the actual publication. You use first name first, last name last, and if there are more than 3 authors, give only the name of the first author and use the abbreviation et al. Next, the title of the article. Rather than italicizing this as with a book title, you would enclose it within quotation marks. Of course, words in the title that might be italicized because they refer to a book title should be italicized. And also follow the same rules of capitalization as for a book title. That is, capitalize the first word of the title and any important words, not including articles or prepositions. Next, the title of the periodical. This should be italicized. Then, the volume or issue number of the periodical, or both. Look on the title page of the periodical to see how they designate specific issues. Some journals use both volume and issue number, like this, volume 36, issue 5. for example. Others use just a volume number, which usually will refer to all the issues that come out in a given year. In this case, they may number the pages consecutively for the whole year from one issue to the next. So in a journal of this kind, if the first issue for the year contains pages 1 through 96, the second issue might contain pages 97 through 192, and so on. For that kind of journal, you would just give the volume number, because that would be enough, together with the page number, for anyone to find the particular article you are referring to. Next, the date of publication. This is probably a month and year. It might be just the year. Then, page numbers. Again, give the page number or numbers to which you are referring. Unless you're referring to the entire article, don't list the pages on which the whole article appears, just the page that this specific footnote is pointing to. Here's a sample of what a footnote for a journal article would look like. This is footnote number 14 in this particular paper. The author of the article is Lyda Judson Hannafin. The article title, within quotation marks, is The Rural School Community Center, followed by, in italics, the name of the journal, Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science. Volume number follows, not in italics, number 67. The date of publication, 1916. Then a colon, and then the page references, 130 to 138. So someone who wanted to find this particular article and see what you were referring to could go to any library or online source that had an archive for the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science, turn to volume 67, which was published in the year 1916, turn to page 130, and find the beginning of this particular article by Hannafin. Now, for an article in a magazine or newspaper, you would provide the same information as for a journal article, except that the volume or issue number can be omitted. For most popular periodicals, magazines, or newspapers, the date alone is enough to identify the issue being referred to. Here's a sample footnote for a newspaper article. This is footnote number 12. Peter R. Cann is the author of the article. The article title, in quotation marks, is A Long Leisurely Drive Through Mekong Delta Tells Much of the War. Then the name of the periodical, in this case a newspaper, in italics, Wall Street Journal. Notice that the word the, which might appear on the masthead of the newspaper, has been omitted. You don't need the, so you would simply write New York Times, Chicago Tribune, Wall Street Journal. You can omit the word the. Then the date, November 10th, 1969, and the page number, page 1. That's where the article appears. Finally, for an online document, your footnote should contain the following information in this order. First, the name of the author or authors of the document you're citing. Next, the title of the article, web page, or other online document. This may take a bit of searching since every web page has its own design and there's little standardization. So scroll up and down the page until you find the title, and in this footnote, put the title in quotation marks. Next, the name of the website. This may take some searching as well. You may need to click through links on the site until you find the home page, also called the index page, where the name of the entire site is usually provided. In the rare occasion where there is no name or title for the website, you can make up a descriptive one. For example, website of the National Association of Civil Rights Attorneys, if there happened to be a website by that group that didn't have an actual name. Whatever the name of the site is, it should be italicized. Next, the city of publication, if it can be determined. Very often, somewhere on the website, it will give the name of the city where the organization or people who created the website are located, and put that in just as you would put the city of publication for a book. Then the sponsor of the website. This is usually some organization. It could be a publisher, a university, an association, a foundation, or a commercial business. The home page or index page, again, is likely to indicate the name of the sponsor. To find it, you might have to click on a link with a name like About Us or Contact Us, which would then take you to a page that explains who created and sponsored the site. Next, the date of publication. This is the date on which the article was posted, if available. Then, the URL of the web page. This is the long string of letters, numbers, and punctuation marks that makes up the web address of the page that you're citing. Copy the URL down into your footnote exactly, or Better yet, use the copy and paste commands from your web browser and word processing software to grab the URL directly from the browser and paste it into your paper. That will minimize the chance of making a typo that renders your footnote useless. And finally, the date of access. This is the date when you found the information on the site. You need to include this because website contents change so frequently. Providing the date will enable your reader to estimate how old your reference is and determine how likely it is that the material will still be available on the website. Here's a sample footnote for a web page reference. This is footnote number 4. The author, Mary Carmichael. The article title, Neuromarketing, Is It Coming to a Lab Near You? Then the name of the website, Frontline, The Persuaders, and the publication location, Boston. The sponsor of the website, WGBH Educational Foundation. Next, the date of publication. Then the URL, http://www.pbs.org/wgh/pages/shows/prbs/etc/neuro.html. And finally, the date of access. Now, sometimes you might be citing the online version of a printed article. For example, you might locate a magazine article, a newspaper article, or an article from a journal by consulting the magazine or newspaper or journal's online archive. So when that's the case, what you want to do is provide the same information you would for the printed article, but then add the name of the website, the URL, and the date of access, and that way your reader can track down the original source either way, either by finding a hard copy of the original article or by going to the same archive that you referred to. Now, these are the basic formats for footnotes according to the Chicago style, which is also more or less the same as Turabian. However, there are many, many variations possible on these basic footnoting rules due to the fact that the materials that a person might cite in a research paper are so varied. For example, suppose you were citing an essay, a story, poem, or article, or other work that was contained in an anthology edited by someone else. Here's how you do it. You begin with the name of the author of the component work, the essay, the story, the poem, or whatever, and then the title of that work, and follow this with the complete information about the anthology, starting with its title. Here's a sample of how you would do that. Umberto Eco, that's the author's name. Here's the component work. How to Organize a Public Library, name of a brief essay enclosed in quotation marks. Then the name of the anthology, A Passion for Books, A Book Lover's Treasury, in italics. Then the names of the editors of the anthology, Ed Harold Rabinowitz and Rob Kaplan. Then the publishing information, New York, Random House, 1999, and the page numbers 37 to 39. So this is how you would construct a footnote for a component work within an anthology. What if you were citing an unpublished dissertation? In other words, an essay that someone wrote for a PhD degree, which you found through the helpful librarian in your own school or public library. Here's how you would cite this unpublished dissertation. The author name, Elizabeth Crowell. The name of the dissertation in quotation marks, Contemporary Political Views of Picasso's Guernica. Then PhD, the abbreviation DISS, which stands for dissertation, the name of the school, Fordham University, the date of the degree, 2003, and the page reference, 89. Now, references to the Bible and to certain classical works of literature have their own special forms. You don't have to provide much of the publishing information that we've discussed in citing contemporary or ordinary books, because there are so many editions of the Bible and of classic works of literature, and it doesn't really matter which edition a person refers to in most cases. So there are special forms that are used for footnoting these kinds of works. A biblical quotation, for example, is referred to using the standard abbreviated name for the book being cited, along with the chapter and verse numbers separated by a colon. So a reference to the book of Deuteronomy might look like this, DEUT, period, 6:13-15. That means this is a reference to chapter 6, verses 13 to 15 of the biblical book of Deuteronomy. Are you wondering where you would find the standard abbreviated names for the books of the Bible? Well, you can find them in your style guide, and many Bibles, in fact, include the standard abbreviations. Now, a reference to the plays of Shakespeare would also follow a specific form that has been developed over the years. So a reference to Shakespeare's Hamlet would include act, scene, and line numbers, like this: Hamlet, comma, 2, period 1, period 16 to 20. So this would be a reference to Hamlet, Act 2, Scene 1, lines 16 to 20. Notice, by the way, that only Arabic numbers are used in these specialized reference forms. In older scholarly works, Roman numerals were often used, but the modern style is to use Arabic numbers exclusively. Now, other classic works, such as Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, many other ancient Greek and Roman works, and books such as the Analects of Confucius, Milton's Paradise Lost, and Hindu scriptures like the Bhagavad Gita, and many others, all have their own specialized reference forms. Now, how can you possibly remember the rules for all these various kinds of references? Well, you can't, of course, and that's why there are the style guides that we've been referring to: the Chicago Manual, the MLA Style Guide, Turabian, the APA Style Guide, and the others. And they run hundreds of pages in length because they walk you through every conceivable form of reference and provide samples and illustrations for each. All of these style guides also happen to have excellent, very detailed indexes where you can look up almost any specific question that might arise while you're working on a particular research paper. So, for example, if you wonder, how do you format a footnote that refers to the proceedings in a court case? What about an unpublished document in a government archive? What about a bit of ephemera like an advertising flyer or a company brochure or a program from a community theater which may not list an author or a publisher or a date? The style guides will discuss each of these situations and more and provide specific formats for you to follow in each case. Now, obviously, in this program, we won't have time to discuss all the many unusual variations that may arise. But the samples that we have walked you through for a book, a journal article, a magazine or newspaper article, and a web page, those samples will cover 90% of the footnotes that you're likely to write for your paper. One more point about footnotes. As we've said, the footnote number should appear at the end of the sentence in which the reference work is cited, and most often each footnote will refer to a single work. But occasionally you may find that in a particular paragraph in your paper you need to refer to 2 or more sources of information. For example, you might write a paragraph in which you summarize the main lines of scholarly thinking about a particular question. And you would want to indicate the sources on which you drew for this summary, which might mean referring to 3 or 4 different books or articles. What's the best way to handle this? One approach would be to insert a different footnote for each reference. Depending on how you write the paragraph, that is exactly where the references fall, this might mean having a footnote at the end of every sentence in the paragraph, or even having 2 or more footnotes in the same sentence. For example, one in the middle of the sentence and one at the end. And this creates an effect that's very awkward and confusing. A better alternative is to combine all the references into a single footnote, which you would put at the end of the paragraph. And then in the footnote itself, at the bottom of the page, you would list all the sources one at a time, and if necessary, include a brief explanation. So you might end up creating a footnote something like this. Footnote number 4. The research summarized in this paragraph is drawn mainly from Jane Mayer, Biblical Symbolism in Melville's Moby Dick, and the publication information is given. Additional information was drawn from Reginald O. Hansen, Ishmael's Old Testament Roots, with publication information, and Wilfred Norman, What About the Whale, with publication information. So here we have one footnote that refers to 3 different research sources and explains briefly in a few words why the 3 are being grouped, that this explains all the references that appear in the entire paragraph, and the reader, instead of being interrupted in his or her reading several times while reading the run paragraph, can simply find all the background information in that one footnote. As long as you make clear what your sources were and how you use them, this kind of note is fine, including those few explanatory words. This is much less obtrusive than distracting the reader with a collection of several footnote numbers within a few words of one another. In a minute, we'll look at the other major formatting challenge that you'll face, which is how to set up your bibliography. But first, a look at another topic that many students struggle with, the use of abbreviations in a research paper. Now, there are a number of abbreviations that you've probably run across while reading journal articles and other scholarly materials as part of your research. And many of these abbreviations are unfamiliar from daily life, and others are used a little differently in scholarship than most people realize. So perhaps you're wondering, am I supposed to use these abbreviations? And if so, how? Here are some pointers you'll find helpful. Generally speaking, abbreviations should be avoided in the text of your paper. Use them only in footnotes and in bibliographic listings or in parenthetical references in the text. As you recall, the APA and MLA style use parenthetical references to books and articles rather than footnotes, and abbreviations can be used in these. Now, within this rule, here are some specific abbreviations you should know along with how to use them. Now, as we've noted, the abbreviation P or PP for page or pages is not necessary in a footnote. You can simply list the page or pages that you're referring to and everyone will understand that those are pages. Now, what about other abbreviations for parts of a book? You can use these in your footnote or your bibliography, but only when they are coupled with a number. So, for example, in a footnote, you might write VOL2, meaning volume 2, CHAP 10, meaning chapter 10, or PT 6, meaning part 6. But you wouldn't write, even in a footnote, also see the next chap of the same book. Instead, you have to write out the word chapter because it's not linked with a number. Next, when you refer to the same work in two consecutive footnotes, use the abbreviation IBID rather than providing all of the bibliographic information. IBID stands for the Latin word ibidem, which means in the same place. If you're referring to the same page in the same work, IBID alone is enough. No other bibliographic information is needed. If you're referring to a different page of the same work, you would give the page number, like this, IBID, 54. When you refer in a footnote to the same work as in an earlier footnote, but another reference has come in between, you can't use IBID because IBID refers to the last footnote. Instead, give the main author's last name, the title of the work, and the page reference. If the title of the work is 4 words or longer, you should shorten it. For example, let's say that we referred to George Lakoff's book, Metaphors We Live By, in 2 separate footnotes, with some other footnotes in between in our paper. Here's how we would do it. The first footnote might look like this. Footnote 1, George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, Metaphors We Live By, Chicago, University of Chicago Press, 1980, 67. Okay, there's the complete bibliographic information. Now, if we refer back to the same book a few notes later, the note would simply say, Note 4, Lakoff, Metaphors, 89. The reader will look back, remember that the book by Lakoff, Metaphors We Live By, was referred to earlier, and this is simply referring to a different page, page 89. So this is how we use a short title in a subsequent reference to the same book. Now, as we've pointed out, in a second or later reference to the same book, a long book title should be shortened. Here's how you do that. First, omit any initial article, that is, a, an, or the, as well as any words that explain the nature of the book rather than describing its content. So you would eliminate words such as a guide to, or a dictionary of, or an introduction to. Finally, decide from among the words that remain which word or words best describes what the book focuses on, and use that as your short title, which would normally just be a word or 2 in length. There's no one correct way to shorten most book titles, but here are some examples of how you might do this when referring to a book for the second or third time in your footnotes. Let's say you were referring to a book called The Decision to Use the Atomic Bomb, a history book analyzing how Truman made that decision. This could be shortened to decision. What if you were writing a psychology paper and you were referring to a book, Cognitive Behavioral Treatment of Borderline Personality Disorder? You could shorten that to Cognitive Behavioral Treatment. You could refer to the philosophy book, The Passion of the Western Mind, simply as Passion. If you were referring to this book, The Happiness of Getting It Down Right, Letters of Frank O'Connor and William Maxwell. You could refer to this simply as Happiness. And finally, yes, this is a real book title, Curse of the Giant Muffins and Other Washington Maladies. That could be shortened to simply Curse. If you think that some readers might find a particular shortened title a bit mysterious or confusing, you can add an explanatory note to the first full reference. So take a look at this sample footnote. Michael Kinsley, Curse of the Giant Muffins and Other Washington Maladies, New York, Summit Books, 1987, 119, parentheses, hereafter cited as Curse. So now throughout the rest of the paper, whenever you want to refer back to this book, you simply call it Curse. At one time, the abbreviation OPCHIT, which means the work cited, was once used for this purpose, that is, to refer back to a work that was mentioned in a previous footnote, though not the immediately preceding footnote. Nowadays, OPCHIT is not really used. It's considered better to use a short title instead. So if you see OPCHIT as an abbreviation in an older piece of scholarship, you know what it means, but don't use OPCHIT yourself. Instead, use the short title to refer back to an earlier referenced book. There are some other abbreviations that are used in scholarly work, mainly in footnotes. CF is short for the Latin word confere, and it means compare. You might use this in a footnote when you want to suggest to the reader that a particular book or article is worth looking at, not so much as the direct source of an idea that you're citing, but as an interesting comparison or an idea that is similar but different. Et al., short for et alia, means and others. As we mentioned earlier, when a work has more than 3 authors, you would use et al. In place of the second, third, and later authors' names. E.g. is short for exempli gratia, and it means for example. You might use this abbreviation to explain that the reference source you're mentioning isn't the only source of an idea, or even the most important one, but that it is simply one example from several that could be mentioned. I.e. is short for id est, and that means that is. Use this expression, i.e., to offer another way of stating, explaining, or clarifying a point. And by the way, be sure to distinguish e.g. from i.e. They mean 2 different things, but some people mistakenly use them as if they're interchangeable. Finally, in older scholarly writings, you may encounter a few other abbreviations or Latin words that you should know, although they're no longer generally used, and you should avoid using them in your work. But you may find them helpful in interpreting an older work of scholarship that you might come across. Passim means throughout. It was formerly used to indicate that a particular idea or theme could be found not just on one or a few pages of a certain book, or even in a particular chapter, but rather throughout the entire work. Infra means below, and supra means above. And in older scholarly works, these Latin words were used to refer to earlier or later portions of a text. Vis is short for vide licet, and it means namely. And you might use this to introduce a specific description of an idea that was described generally before. Nowadays, scholars will just say namely, rather than using the Latin abbreviation. As you can see, there are really just a small handful of specialized abbreviations that scholars need to know and use today. Write these few down, practice them, and soon you'll find that abbreviations and Latin terms don't give you any special difficulty. Finally, bibliography. As we've seen in a Chicago-style research paper, footnotes provide source information throughout the paper. All of the sources used are listed in one place for easy reference at the end of the paper. And while much of the information that is listed here will be the same as the information used in the footnotes, it is organized differently. Let's take a few minutes to look at how you should pull together this final piece of your paper's scholarly apparatus. Again, in APA or MLA style, a bibliography also appears, but the information is organized slightly differently, and you'll need to refer to the specific style guide that your teacher recommends to get the punctuation and organization of the bibliography material correct. First, what should you call this section of the paper? There are various options. They include bibliography, selected bibliography, works cited, sources consulted, references. You may even run across other variations. As you can see, each of these titles has a slightly different meaning. Bibliography is most general. Selected bibliography suggests that the list of works that you're including isn't all-inclusive, but contains only those books and articles that you found most relevant and useful. Works cited implies that your list will include every work for which you had a footnote and no others. And sources consulted and references, like bibliography, are quite broad. So choose the title that suits you best. Your choice may depend in part on your teacher's preference, since he or she may have an idea about the kind of bibliography that he or she wants. It may also depend on how you feel your research went. If you ended up reading or looking at lots of works that turned out not to be terribly relevant, you may want to restrict your list only to works cited and keep it selective. If you have a list of very good works that you didn't specifically cite in your footnotes, but that were very relevant and helpful as sources of background information, then go for a more general bibliography or sources consulted and list them all. In some cases, for example, if you're writing a long paper with many sources and many kinds of sources, you may even want to divide up your bibliography into various categories of works. For example, you could create a bibliography that listed under separate headings primary sources and secondary sources. Or for a different kind of paper, you might have a bibliography divided up into government documents, interviews conducted, and published works. It all depends on what format will present your research most accurately and will be most clear and helpful to your reader. As you do your research and read lots of scholarly articles and books, look at how they handle the bibliographies, and you may pick up an idea or two that will be useful to you in organizing and naming your bibliography. For simplicity's sake, from this point in the program, we'll just call it a bibliography. Now, just to make life a little more confusing, the various style guides also differ slightly in the look of bibliographic references. They all provide almost the same information for a book or article that's being referred to, but they organize and present it slightly differently. To illustrate, let's consider how each of the big three style guides, that is APA, MLA, and Chicago, would handle a bibliographic listing for the same book. The book is titled Metaphors We Live By, and the authors are George Lakoff and Mark Johnson. In APA style, a bibliographic reference to this book would look like this: Lakoff, G., and Johnson, M., 1980, Metaphors We Live By, Chicago, University of Chicago Press. Now in MLA style, the same book would be included in a bibliography that reads like this: Lakoff, George, and Mark Johnson, Metaphors We Live By, underlined, Chicago, U of Chicago P, 1980. And in the Chicago/Turabian style, the exact same book would be referred to in the bibliography this way: Lakoff, George, and Mark Johnson, Metaphors We Live By, Chicago, University of Chicago Press, 1980. Notice the differences. For bibliographic data, MLA style is almost the same as the Chicago or Turabian style, although MLA recommends abbreviating publisher names, while Chicago suggests spelling them out. APA style, on the other hand, is very different. The order of details is different, with the publication date coming second rather than last. In addition, only the first initials of the author's names are given, rather than the entire name. The name of the second author, like that of the first author, is given last name first, rather than the other way around. And most subtly, only the first word of the title is capitalized, rather than all of the important words. Here's the order of information in the bibliographic entry using Chicago and Turabian style, for example. For a book, you begin with the name of the author or authors, and you invert the name of the author, that is, put the last name first. If it's a multi-author work, you do this for the first author only. This is because you'll be alphabetizing the bibliographic entries by author's last name, so you want to start the entry with the author's last name. Next, title and subtitle, italicized. Then the name of the editor, compiler, or translator, if any. Then the name or number of the edition, if any. Then the name of the series in which the book appears, if any, with volume or number. Then the place of publication, the name of the publisher, the date of the publication, and the page number or numbers that you used in your research. If the entire book was relevant to your research, then no page numbers are needed. If it was one part or one chapter of the book that you referred to, then list that. Notice how the indentation and punctuation are different in a bibliographic entry as compared to a footnote. We'll see an example in a moment. You'll notice that there are no parentheses around the publication data this time. There's no special reason why. It's another salad fork issue where you just have to know the rules and follow them precisely. Here's a comparison. Remember this sample footnote we looked at earlier. Francis Fukuyama, The Great Disruption, Human Nature, and the Reconstitution of Social Order. New York, The Free Press, 1999, page 119. Here's what the bibliographic listing for the same book would look like. Fukuyama, Francis, period. Notice the author's last name appears first. Then the book title, The Great Disruption, Human Nature and the Reconstitution of Social Order, period. Now the publication data with no parenthesis. New York, The Free Press, 1999, period. In this case, no page numbers or chapter listing is given because the author of this particular paper referred to the entire book in doing research for the paper. Here's the order of information for a bibliographic reference for an article in a journal. Begin with the name of the author, last name first. If more than one author, again, give the second and third author's names in the normal order. Next, title of the article in quotation marks. Then the title of the periodical, italicized. Then the volume or issue number, or both if both are used. Then the date of publication, and the page numbers of the entire article from start to finish. For an article in a magazine or newspaper, as opposed to a journal, provide the same information, except that the volume or issue number can be omitted. Finally, for an online document, the name of the author or authors, last name first. Then the title of the article, web page, or other document. The name of the website. The place of publication, if it can be determined. The sponsor of the website. The date of publication. This is the date on which the article was posted, if available. The URL and the date of access. If you're citing the online version of a printed article, you provide the same information you would for the printed article, but the name of the website, the URL, and the date of access should also be added. Now, to create your bibliography, you're going to list the works alphabetically by the last name of the author, or the last name of the lead author if there's more than one author. If you used index cards to keep track of your bibliographic information while doing your research, it'll be easy to create the bibliography by just working from the cards. Just stack them alphabetically and start typing. Actually, even this isn't always as simple as you might think. Alphabetizing authors' names can sometimes be tricky, especially with foreign names. Here are a few examples that illustrate how tricky proper names can be. Scientist Werner von Braun, for example, would be alphabetized under B, not V. Painter Willem de Kooning would be alphabetized under D, not K. New York Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia would be listed under L, not G, and statesman Stephen Van Rensselaer would be listed under V, not R. If you're uncertain how to alphabetize a particular name in your bibliography, a handy trick is to look up the author's name in the biographical list at the end of Merriam-Webster's Collegiate Dictionary or in the index of Webster's New Biographical Dictionary. These are two reference works that can be found in most libraries and that list hundreds or thousands of individuals' names. You can take guidance from how the name is handled there. Now, if you have two authors with the same last name, but they're different authors, alphabetize them by first name. And if one happens to be commonly known solely by one or two initials, you would alphabetize that one before another with the same initial but a complete name. Confused? Take a look at this sample. Here we have three authors, J.B. Adams, John Adams, and John Quincy Adams. How do we alphabetize them? Well, John comes before John Quincy because the John Quincy is a longer name. There are more letters there. And the Q puts it after the just plain John. And J.B., those initials, they share the same initial with John, J and J, but J.B. is just initials, so by our rule, that name precedes the name that is fully spelled out. So J.B. Adams comes first, then John Adams, then John Quincy Adams. Now, what if an author publishes his or her works under a pseudonym? Do you use the pseudonym or the real name? List that author under the pseudonym, and if the author's real name is known, indicate it in square brackets after the pseudonym. So if, for example, you had a bibliographic entry for Mark Twain, you would list him as Twain, Mark, and then in square brackets list his real name, Samuel L. Clemens. Finally, if you list two or more works by the same author, you would give the author's name in full in the first listing. And then for the second or later works that are listed by that same author, rather than repeat the name, you substitute an 8-space underscore, an underline that is exactly 8 spaces long, followed by a period, for the author's name, like this. Here we have a sample from a bibliography in which 3 separate books by the author Taylor Branch are being listed. Here's how they would be listed. The first book is Branch, Taylor, Parting the Waters, America in the King Years, 1954 to 63. New York, Touchstone, 1988. Now the second book by the same author, Taylor Branch, rather than repeating Branch, Taylor, we have an 8-space underscore followed by a period, and then the publishing information and title for the second book, Pillar of Fire, America in the King Years, 1963 to 65, New York, Simon & Schuster, 1999. And then our third book by the same author, again an 8-space underscore, and then the title, At Canaan's Edge, America in the King Years, 1965 to 68, New York, Simon & Schuster, 2006. Notice that we've listed the works in chronological order based on publication date. Thus, the oldest work is listed first, then the second, and so on up to the newest. So if you have 2 or more books or articles by the same author in your bibliography, this is how you would handle that. Well, that completes our discussion of what many students consider to be the worst part of the research paper challenge. That is, the painful, nitpicking detail that goes into getting your scholarly apparatus right. Yes, it can be a nuisance. It may seem arbitrary and even silly at times, but look on the bright side. The principles for creating footnotes and a bibliography are not, in the end, terribly difficult. They're basically mechanical, include such and such data laid out according to the following rules with the particular punctuation marks that are prescribed. If you can follow a recipe in a cookbook or assemble a piece of furniture according to the instructions in a kit, then you shouldn't have too much trouble getting the citations in your research paper right. It's a very similar process. Well, we're heading into the home stretch now. In our next and final program, we'll talk about some final considerations that are important in getting the style and tone of your paper right, including some ways of ensuring that in your paper you sound every bit as smart and well-informed as you actually are. We'll provide some stylistic writing tricks that should help ensure that you earn the highest possible grade on your paper. Thanks for watching, and I'll be looking forward to seeing you next time.
If you or someone you know needs to learn English as a second language, starting from the very beginning, then Video-Aided Instructions Learning English Steps 1, 2, 3 is exactly what you need. This 11-hour, 83-lesson course will teach you how to start using English in your everyday life, at school, and on the job. This developmental program gives you lots of practice in the basics of listening, speaking, reading, and writing in English. Plus, we teach you important vocabulary words in every lesson. It's quick, it's easy, and it really works. Visit us online at videoaidedinstruction.com for more information about learning English Steps 1, 2, 3. Don't let poor English skills stand in the way of your success. Mastering English unlocks a world of opportunities. Let Video-Aided Instruction give you the key.